stuff related to talking about real estate.
All right, thanks everybody. My name is Tom Gaze. I'm director of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. I'm sorry I wasn't able to come a bit earlier, but welcome to the Rockefeller Institute. It's wonderful to have all of you here, and also thanks to Mike Hattery, Bob Bolick, everybody on our staff for actually putting this together, and all of you panelists and participants and attendees coming here. We're starting another sessions on public employee pensions, investment risk, and local contribution policy implications for New York State. I really like these, there are going to be two papers. I really like what these people are doing, not just because they're near and dear to me, but just a short little story. I was just in Miami, Florida. Nothing particularly exciting about it, actually. It was the conference for the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management last week. And I went to a lot of sessions, and some of them did deal with some local government issues and pension issues, et cetera. And they were very good papers. I mean, the level of research is excellent. However, a lot of the papers are based on sort of experimental evidence or pretty extensive econometric analyses, and they hold lots of variables constant in order to estimate the relationship between between particular variables. Well, unfortunately, the world doesn't always hold a lot of variables constant, and so a lot of public policy, a lot of public officials and citizens and other people need to understand, well, what happens when you have a lot of things that are varying, whether they be local circumstances or whether they be various actuarial assumptions or changes in the world in terms of what's happening in the markets, et cetera. And fortunately, the people that you're listening to today, or at least in this particular session, are dealing with those kinds of possible interaction effects and complexities. We're seeing both in the work that is done by Don Boyd and Yimeng at the Rockefeller Institute, as well as David Matkin and Chen at the Rockefeller College. They're doing work that really uses simulations in order to understand how many different variables might interact and produce results that are really quite surprising. So, we're going to have, I'm not going to say too much about them, but the first paper is Pension Fund Investment Risk and Potential Consequences for State and Local Governments by Don Boyd and Yimeng at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Don is our Director of Fiscal Studies here at the Institute. Yimeng is a programmer here and assistant and researcher here at the Institute. He's also pursuing his doctoral degree in economics at the University at Albany. After that, we will have David Matkin and Chen at the Rockefeller College give a paper on searching for policy alternatives to local government pension contribution roller coaster. David, in addition to being an assistant professor, is also a visiting fellow here at the Institute. Chen is also an assistant professor at Rockefeller College and also somebody we like to work with. So we'll start off with Don and Yimeng Yin, and so why don't we, and each of you all have 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So Iman and I are going to proceed in two stages. I'm going to just try to provide a little bit of context, New York kind of in the national context as far as, kind of pension costs are concerned, and then I'll briefly describe our big project, and then Iman's going to get into, kind of what we're doing and what we're learning so far, and then I'll wrap up. So let me leap right into the New York in the national context. I'm not going to try to read this table to you, but at your leisure, you can see the major pension plans in New York State. We have, in aggregate, about $430 billion worth of assets. New York City's about $140 billion of that. The state and the local governments around New York participate in the state-administered plans. So unlike some places a city will have its own plan. That's not the case in New York. So for good or for bad, local governments in New York are kind of bound to the experience of the state-administered plans. In aggregate, they are slightly better funded than the typical plan for the U.S. as a whole, about 80% funded versus 72% funded. And it's a big difference. The New York state-run plans are over 90% funded, and the city-run plans are somewhat over 60% funded. There's a very, very big difference. And I also give the contributions. These plans, the employers, the state government, New York City, local governments around the state are making currently about $18 billion worth of contributions annually versus roughly $121 billion for the U.S. as a whole. A couple of important distinctions. So we have a sole trustee system for the state administered, the ERS and police and fire, the controller, and that may well have some, real importance for how contributions are made by local governments. So I want to mention that compared to all the others that have independent boards. One of the things that distinguishes certainly the state-run plans from plans elsewhere in the country is that they tend to raise contributions relatively quickly, say after an investment income shortfall, compared to the rest of the nation. Part of it is shorter amortization periods for the state and local retirement system, meaning that losses tend to be recouped from local governments over a relatively shorter time period. Another is the legal environment where at least I think the popular interpretation is probably that due to a state Court of Appeals decision back in 1993, local governments kind of must pay what actuaries request. That, believe it or not, is not the practice necessarily throughout the country. Lots of cases where states either episodically or on a regular basis pay something different, and usually that's less than what the plans request. There are some enforcement mechanisms, such as potential withholding of state aid for contributions. So there are some things in New York that cause contributions to be paid, and paid at least recently at a higher rate than elsewhere. There is a contribution stabilization program you're probably all familiar with, which kind of partially undoes this, but quite frankly, I don't think it undoes it as much as the usual practices applied throughout the country. Just a couple of quick numbers on what I mean by that. At your leisure, you can look at this table, but what it shows is total employer contributions by state and local governments in New York State and in the U.S. as a whole, and how they've changed from 2006 to 2014. I picked 2006 as kind of a pretty good year before financial markets took their most recent substantial dive. And a couple of things. So the top half of the table shows you actual dollars, and they're big. New York's state and local government contributions into both the state-run plans and the city plans increased between 2006 and 2014 annually by $9.9 billion. So that's a lot of money. That's 122%. It's a huge increase. There are folks who sometimes say, well, pensions aren't really a very big part of state budgets or local budgets. In some cases, that used to be true. Clearly, this is a very sizable amount of money in New York. And you can see that New York increased more rapidly than elsewhere. And I do believe much of that's attributable to the kind of faster funding response of the plans, although we haven't studied that in detail in New York. The other thing the other part of the header of the table is they're higher in New York than elsewhere. And the bottom half of the table shows that. It shows that in 2014, per capita, state and local governments around the country were paying $380 per capita into their state and local pension funds. New York, state and local governments were paying $917 per capita. So that's about 2.4 times as great. And in fact, the increase between 2006 and 2014 in New York was $427 per capita, which is more than the entire U.S. even pays right now. So it's very substantial level of contributions in New York, very substantial increases, much more rapid than in the U.S. as a whole. So New York plans are, by and large, certainly for the state-run plans, better funded than the typical plan. However, they still face some risks of the very kind that Yimeng is going to talk about in a minute. They're heavily invested in equity-like assets. We have relatively high benefits in New York, reflecting both relatively high wages and relatively good benefits. So that means we got a lot of assets that could fall short if they're invested heavily in equities. It's also in New York and elsewhere much harder to achieve assumed investment returns than elsewhere. Back in 1992, you could put your money in 30-year treasuries and earn 7.8%. If you're assuming 8%, it's not too hard to get there. Now it's about 3.1%. So much, much riskier environment. The only way you can achieve the same kinds of assumed returns is to take a lot more risk. Some economists concluded that New York taxpayers would have the second highest cost in the nation to get to full funding if they weren't to take risk, about a $2,250 annual increase per household. State and local retirement system has recently lowered its earnings assumption, which is going to, effectively raise contributions, but that's still, in an environment in which treasuries are yielding 3.1%, requires substantial investment risk. And that is really what our project is about, is what do these risks mean for state and local governments? Nationally, $3.7 trillion are invested in public pension fund assets. About 2/3 are in equity-like assumptions under some assets under some reasonable assumptions. There's maybe a 1 in 6 chance of falling short by, say, 12% or more. Call it $450 billion. That's a lot of money. And of course, the plans take the risk, but it's the governments and ultimately their stakeholders, their taxpayers, that bear that risk. And so that's what we're doing, is we're analyzing this risk and the implications for state and local governments, risks to the plans, risks to the governments. We're going to analyze specific plans and examine best practices for managing and communicating the risk. We're looking nationally. We're beginning with what I call prototypical plans. We will eventually be examining very specific plans. It's not a project that's about New York, but it's relevant to New York. And with that, let me ask Yimeng to come up and talk in more detail about what we're doing.
Okay, thank you, Don. Here, I'm going to briefly introduce the model we're developing and the results from our current analysis. So, to quantify and evaluate the risk faced by the public pension plans, we have developed and are still developing this Rockefeller Institute pension simulation model. And the goal of this model is to mimic the behavior of the real-world plans and simulate the pension finance under alternative funding policies and different investment return scenarios. Okay, thank you. Okay, so to do so in the model, we first need to do actuarial valuation for the pension plans in each year of the simulation period in order to calculate the liability borne by the pension plans, which is, roughly speaking, is the present value of the accrued benefit payment promised by the pension plan. So To do so, we need to first a simulation of the demographic dynamics in the workforce and use the benefit structure of the plan as inputs. And also the funding policy of the plan will provide the rule by which the sponsor make contribution to the pension fund. And with all of this actual value evaluation, we can simulate the pension finance in a certain investment return scenario. So in the stochastic simulation, we will create 1,000 investment return scenarios, assuming the investment return follows some statistical distribution. And in each investment return scenario, we simulate the pension finance and get the resulting fund status and contribution level. With this 1,000 simulation, we can have a distribution of all of these possible outcomes of pension fund status and contribution, and we can analyze their risk. And the design philosophy of this model is first transparency. We will want to make it completely open source and reproducible. And a long-term goal of this project is to develop a user-friendly web interface to the model. So we want to develop this model into a tool that can facilitate the discussion of the public pension risk issue. Okay. So to give a feel about what the results of the model may look like, here we present the results from two selected single model runs. So these two graphs shows the annual investment returns and the cumulative compound annual return from the two selected model runs. So note that both of these two runs had the same 30-year compound annual return, which is 7.5%. And this number is very typical assumption of investment return used by a typical public pension plan. So this allows us to examine the pension finance when the investment return assumption is met. We can see that although both of these two runs have the same compound annual return at ending year, but they generally experience very different paths of the annual investment return. And the annual return can fluctuate wildly. And you can see that there can be very different across different runs of the model. And the good returns can come early in the first simulation, and good returns can come late in the second simulation. Okay, so with these investment return scenarios, we can simulate the pension finance. So the left panel shows the employer contribution as a percentage of payroll of the two plans, and the right panel shows the funding ratio, which is calculated by the market asset value of the plan. So two observations. First, we can see the employer contribution rate and the funding ratio can fluctuate wildly during the simulation period. So for this simulation run, we can see that from year 10 to year 15, the employer contribution can rise from 5% of the payroll to over 10% of the payroll. That's an increase over 100%, which can impose a great political and physical pressure on the sponsoring government. And you can see the funding ratio can also fluctuate very wildly. And the second observation is that there can be a huge difference between different investment scenarios, even when the investment return assumption is met. So you can see in this scenario, the employer contribution can go as high as over 20%, and the funding ratio can drop as low as below 50%, which is terribly low for a pension plan. And by contrast, in another scenario, the contribution rate is much lower, and the funding ratio is much higher. So this gives us a sense about the risk the pension plan may face. So with this model, we can examine how the pension plan risk can be affected by various aspects of the characteristics of the plan. And here we focus on funding policy, which is the topic of our first report. And by funding policy, we mean how the sponsor makes decision about how much contribution to make. And first, the sponsor need to calculate the actuarial determined contribution. And we examine 3 elements of funding policy that determines this actuarial determined contribution or ADC. First, the discount rate is also the assumed investment return. So because the actuarial liability depends on this discount rate, the higher the rate, actually the lower the liability and the lower the contribution. So generally, pension plans will prefer higher discount rate and the amortization period. And different amortization period can lead to very different payment scheme when they pay up the difference between their expected investment income and actual investment income. And the asset smoothing method will add another layer of smoothing to the contribution level. And this table shows us the prevalence of different amortization method. And the more backloaded amortization method accounts for about 40% of the plan in PPD database, but it accounts for 55% of unfunded liability of the plan. So this means the poor funding is also associated with some more backloaded funding method. And ADC sometimes can also be overridden by the statutory rule. So the pension plan can make less contribution than the ADC. So we have 2 major metrics of the risk. First one is volatility in employer contribution. And the second one is the low funding ratio risk, which is measured by the probability of the funding ratio falling below 40% during 30 years. And here are 4 different funding policy we're going to present here. And we have a common policy, which is pretty backloaded, and a common policy with a contribution cap. It is 20% of the payroll. And for comparison, we simulate the less backloaded funding policy. And as a benchmark, here is funding policy described in the Society of Actuary Blue Ribbon Panel report. It uses a lower discount rate because they argue that the discount rate should be associated with the risk-free investment return. Okay, so here we have the results. We can see that the low funding ratio risk in the common funding policy increased sharply over time, and imposing a cap on the employer contribution can make this risk even higher. And a less backloaded funding policy will lead to a low funding ratio risk, but only at an expense of higher employer contribution. But this higher employer contribution only happens in the early years of the simulation. As they pay off their unfunded liability, they will have a lower contribution in later years. But this high contribution in early years may make them very politically unpopular for the pension sponsors. Okay, so this graph shows us the trade-off between 2 types of risk. So the horizontal axis is about the low funding ratio risk, and the vertical axis is the contribution volatility. You can see the less backloaded policy will have a very low funding ratio risk, but the contribution rate can rise as high as 20% of the payroll in 5 years. And the common funding policy will have a much higher low funding ratio risk, but the contribution volatility will also be lower. In the blue ribbon panel policy, it seems that both types of risk are lower, but this comes at an expense of much higher contribution level. So generally, our conclusion from this analysis is that the commonly used funding policies are not adequate for good funding status, and the plans can face significant contribution volatility. And to dampen this contribution volatility, they will come with a greater risk of severe underfunding and high contribution increase in the long run. And for the New York State plans, they're less backloaded, but because of this trade-off, these policies will reduce the risk of low funding, but make the contributions more volatile. Okay. So we have a second report from this project focusing on mainly the demographic, how the demographics will affect the pension funding risk, and how the investment policy and benefit policies will affect the pension risk. And after that, we'll do 5 specific plans in greater details to see their risk, and it will make recommendations about best practices for analyzing and communicating risk. So I will give back to Don for the concluding remarks.
Okay, thanks, Yimeng. We're going to finish up super fast here. Plans are taking investment risk in an effort to keep contributions low. That risk is not borne by plans per se, but by governments and stakeholders. We think the magnitude is very large, both what you saw in New York and the example I gave before. There's no easy way out. Plans can kind of de-risk and reduce volatility. Even small changes like the controller's reduction in discount rate from 7.5% to 7% represent very large increases in contributions for governments. To get a lot more risk out of the system, it's much bigger contribution increases would be required. And ultimately, communicating those risks are pretty important because they're still there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David and Gong.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chen. I'm working on this research with David Matkin. Our research actually well followed the last research, as Dong and Yimeng point out some really important issues in the pension systems in this country. We add to that by looking at using some real data to test this problem, and also add to testing some contribution policies, some features in the contribution policies. And we also want to show you the story here in New York State. So this is the graph, shows the contribution rate in New York State. This is the biggest pension system in New York State, the New York State employee retirement system and the police and fire retirement system. So this is the system that all of the local governments in New York State except New York City joined this system. And they are asked to pay this contribution rate, as this is the required contribution every year. This is the contribution rate they have to pay every year, and they call this a contribution rate roller coaster. The reason they call it is because, Dong also point this out, in a year, this contribution rate can be above 15% of the payroll. In another year, this can be over 25%, or if you look at a previous year, it's below 5% of the payroll. So I don't know how big this is in your budget, but if you look at the national average, on a national average, the pension contribution account for about 8% of the budget. So if you imagine that 1 year the pension contribution is double the size of the contribution that you make last year, this will be a significant impact on the budget, and it will also increase the difficulty for you for the local governments to keep up with that contribution. So our task here is to measure this volatility of the contribution and to see how that impact the local government's decision to fully pay this contribution amount, and also to see how do we use contribution policies to reduce this volatility in the contribution. So our research question first is if we have instability, we call it instability, volatility is the same thing. If we have instability in pension contribution, would that reduce the percent of required contribution payment? For local governments in other states, they might have a choice not to fully pay this required contribution. And in New York State, the story is different because we have this legal framework to enforce this full payment. But in other states, they might not. And we see that if they have instability in pension contribution, required contribution, would that reduce the chance of them to fully pay this required contribution? The second research question look at what contribute to this instability of required contribution. ADC is the required contribution that Dong and Yimeng already defined it. It's the required contribution that calculated by system actuaries in order to fully fund these pension systems. And then third research question will look at if we impose a cap on the contribution amount or if we fix the contribution rate. In some states, they do that, or some local systems, they use a fixed contribution rate. How would that affect the solvency and the required contribution of the pension system? So just a few words about how we define this. So ADC, ADC here is a required contribution that calculated by actuaries. Sometimes they, in previous accounting rule, according to previous accounting rules, they also call it ARC, annual required contribution. Now we refer to this as the same thing. So the required contribution consists of two parts. The first part is the normal cost. Normal cost is the pension cost an individual employee accrue in the system every year. So by working one more year, that employee will accrue more cost to be funded by the system. So that part should be stable. Another portion of the required contribution comes from the unfunded liabilities. If a system has unfunded liabilities, they can amortize these unfunded liabilities. The portion, the amortization cost of those unfunded liabilities is another portion of the required contribution, and it also might be a big portion of the contribution. How they calculate the unfunded liability? The unfunded liability is the gap between the accrued liability and the asset value. So this explains why there is a volatility in the required contribution. If they invest those pension assets, heavily invested with risky investments, then the volatility of the asset value will pass on to this volatility of the contribution. And if we have a concern that the pension system are going riskier in their investment, that risk, that's the risk Dong and Yimeng talked about, that risk will pass on to this contribution risk. Some systems, if they have a choice, they can choose not to fully pay their required contribution. So the portion of the required contribution that actually pay is defined as the percent of ADC pay, which is the ratio between actual contribution and the required contribution. We define the instability by comparing the required contribution with the past 3 years average. So if there's a dramatic rise in the required contribution, we see this as a volatility, and we see that will affect employers' decision to decide whether to fully pay this required contribution or not. So if you look at the New York State system comparing to one other state system, this is the contribution rate in New York State, and this is the contribution rate in South Dakota. Really flat. and this is the New York State, and that's how we define the volatility. A short answer to our research question is that yes, we see instability of contribution rate affect system's decision to decide whether to fully fund this required contribution or not. We found that investment allocation, employee contribution, and cost allocation methods affect the instability of the required contribution. And we found that increased certainty in contributions is at the risk of solvency. So there is a trade-off between solvency and the volatility of the contribution. We're still working on this. There might be some best practice we can identify where we can keep a balance between this volatility of the contribution and the solvency of the system. So we use regression to test the first and the second question, and the third question we use our simulation is to answer the third question. Just show you some results, some preliminary result of our finding. We found that when the ADC, when the required contribution increased by 1% of the payroll from the past 3 years average, when there's a 1% increase, employers reduce their actual contribution by 0.67% of the required contribution. So just to put this in context, on national average, the required contribution is 16.5% of the payroll, and on average, pension systems every year pay about 91% of the required contribution. On average, they don't fully pay their required contribution. So if we factor this in, if we increase this required contribution by 1%, this average percent of ARC pay will even go down. And that's because they cannot keep up with this increase of the required contribution in that year, because there's a dramatic increase from a 3-year average. The second research question, we look at what contribute to this volatility. And we see that, of course, investment strategies, the investment risk will pass on to these contribution risks. So if a pension system invests more on equities, in order to increase the volatility, if they increase their investment on alternatives, alternative investments are those investments that are not equities, fixed income, or money market. So including those commodities, derivatives, real estate. If they increase their investment on those alternative investments, the volatility of the contribution rate is likely to go down. Funding ratio also reduce this volatility, but higher funding ratio, if you have a if you have more asset to support your liabilities, you are not likely to have a high volatility in contribution. Also find that employee contribution reduce the volatility, because the employee contribution is the very stable revenue for the system. So if you have a large portion of the contribution coming from the employees, there's a way to reduce the volatility. And this is, we also look at some cost methods, some actual assumptions about how they allocate this cost. So if you allocate a cost in a way, factor that, fix that as a level percent of the payroll, that's also a way to reduce the volatility. With that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, David Matkin.
Okay, so we look at this third question here, which gets into the simulation where we were wanting to know if you use various sort of contribution strategies, how does that affect both the instability as well as the funding ratio, the solvency of the plan? And this is really getting at just a few the various ways we looked at it, and I would not want you to take away from what the numbers I'm going to show you as exact examples, but more as sort of relational effects of kind of comparing one to another and the relative difference that creates. And so we're using these simulations, stochastic simulations, and we're just going to take a pension plan that we created that is 100% funded in its first year, and therefore its funding rate, its contribution rate is fairly low because it has no unfunded liability, and so it's all the way down to 7% to be able to cover its normal costs. And then we took 12 different runs at this plan, using simulations for each of the runs, and that's based on 6 different contribution rate strategies, and I'm going to show you those on the next screen, and then 2 different portfolio allocations. And so this is fairly simple. Like I said, it's not, not meant to cover every single possible way of doing this, but it's just intended to give you some sort of a relational effect. And then we're looking at this, running the simulations over 30 years, and we're capturing the average effect over the 30 years, both in terms of the mean contribution rate, the mean funding ratio, and the volatility of those funding ratios and contribution rates. Okay. So let me just highlight to you, because I'm only going to show you 4 of these. So let's see if I can click on the wrong thing. It might make my life worse. Let's see. Now it's become a mouse. All right. I'm doing it again. Okay. So I'm going to look at this one system. Remember, this is very stylized. So one system where the sponsor is paying their full contribution rate that their actuary determines, but in this one, they're not going to amortize the unfunded liability at all. So this is highly stylized. And they're not going to smooth their assets. They're just basically going to say, every year we will make sure that we are 100% funded, or as close to 100% funded as we can in that year. And so we'll take on all of the risk from the investments into the budget, and we'll let the budget absorb it. The next one we're going to look at is this where they're trying to pay the full actuarially determined contribution, but they're using sort of conventional strategies. They're calculating their asset levels over a 5-year smoothing process so that they're not just taking the market valuation, and they're allowing unfunded liabilities to be paid for over future amortization processes, and keeping that open. So they're just, anytime there's an increase in their unfunded liabilities, they just keep pushing it out, and then over 30 years. So it's a very common sort of strategy here to deal with volatility. And then we're going to compare those 2 strategies to a contribution rate that has a cap of 25% as a share of payroll. So if no matter where it goes, if assets drop in value, once the contribution rate hits 25, it's just going to stay fixed there until the market catches the plan up, and then it'll go back down after. And using these same actuarial practices that were used with the full contribution rate. And then the last one we're looking at here is a plan that just says, we're going to just fix our contribution rate at 14.5%, which is the national average, and we'll just keep doing that and expect that over time things will turn out. Okay, and so in that case, it doesn't really matter whether they smooth their assets or amortize in their calculation of what they're paying, because they are not really paying the actuarially determined contribution. They're paying a statutorily determined contribution, or something akin to that. Okay. And then we're going to we looked at the historical data from the public pension database from the Center for Retirement Research over at Boston College, and we gathered what the average returns are for different asset classes and what the volatility or the standard deviation of those has been over the last, over the history. It's like 15 years about that we get that data. And we created two very stylized portfolios, one where we've just evenly distributed out assets from a starting point evenly into those various asset classes, and one where we loaded 50% of them into equities, into stocks. And then we ran the simulations, and what I'm showing you here is the funding ratios for those various strategies. So you can see each of the four clusters are the different funding ratio strategies that I described, and the line on the left is the 50% equity, and the line on the right of each one of these little clusters is where there's 20% equity. And so not surprisingly, these are funding ratios. The variation, well, let me give you one more orientation to this. The line in the middle and the number that you're seeing is the mean over the 30-year period. And the range that you're seeing is one standard deviation of the observed values over the 30 years, okay? So if you want to kind of imagine that this would be the most likely sort of range that you would be able to observe a plan in that situation if there was no kind of black swan event, if things just sort of happen the way they typically happen over 30 years. And so, this is me putting on my assumption hat. But if you want to go out to 95%, you could just double these ranges, right? And then you're capturing like 95% of the observations, essentially. So you can see here that the funding ratio, if you pay the full arc and you don't smooth and you don't amortize, your funding ratio is just going to hang out there right around 100%, the vast majority of the time. That should be expected. And if you have a little more risk in the system, it's going to increase a little bit of the randomness, but it's going to be pretty predictable. You go all the way over here to just fixing your contribution, and you've got ranges up to being at 200% all the way down to being at 0 or unfunded for a long period. So basically, completely bankrupting the plan. And then here's a more typical, the way plans usually operate, or if they did pay the full contribution rate, you can see about 81% we saw them floating around at, which is pretty close to what you see in practice, and then with a range of up to about 110 and down to 50%, which is again kind of what you see in practice. And so when there was a cap on the rate being able to go above 25%, the lower risk plan, the one that was only 20% in assets, stayed about the same as this plan that was amortizing, or that was allowing the contribution rate to go above 25%. But the one that was at a higher risk level had quite a big increase in its volatility of its funding ratio. And now I'm going to go to the contribution rate effects. So let me just take a visual of that. I'm going to flip back to the funding rate ratio screen. So you see that this range of the contribution rate, that's what you're facing if you're going to try and keep your plan 100% funded all the time. Is you're going to have to deal with this kind of level of volatility in your contribution rate. And here is the fixed, right? We force that to not be able to change. And then here are these middle two approaches. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me is you see this typical approach where they're trying to pay at least the actuarially determined contribution, and it's maintaining a relatively similar level of variation but coming to a better, less risk that you're going to go insolvent in a pension system. And so you can kind of see the justification for why this pension approach has developed as kind of the standard practice, because it reduces contribution volatility to at a reasonable level, while keeping the plans, at least giving them the best chance of being fully funded. And so just this is my last slide of any importance. And just summarizes that we see that instability is really associated with funding level insufficiency in actual practice, and we also see what sort of variables are not, I think, not surprisingly associated with creating that instability, and that this research at a preliminary stage is starting to give us some sort of insight into why governments have been behaving the way they have, but also sort of what are the ramifications of taking some normative steps to changing how they do make their contribution policies. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Does anybody want to pose any questions to our panelists? Yes, back here, and please give us your name.
Joel Margolis, private citizen. Is there anybody in the panel who could give an estimate of the health care costs for retirees compared to pension costs?
She's doing it.
Because obviously the health care costs are not covered under any kind of system that we're talking about.
Right. Anyone? You guys want to talk about other than pension costs?
So on a national basis, what you're referring to are what we talk about as OPEBs, or other post-employment benefits, two common types of retirement obligations, one for the pensions, and then the other for the others, meaning other than pensions. So we call them other post-employment OPEBs, and those across the board are underfunded. Maybe when pensions are around 85% funded or 75% in that range, we're talking about 10% funded in the OPEBs, and the range is, I don't know off the top of my head what New York State's is at, but the range across the country is significant from 0% and a meaningful portion of payroll to 0% and a small, minuscule amount of payroll input.
Yeah, I'm sure New York State and New York City combined are certainly well over, probably over $140 billion now in terms of unfunded liability. But it's a very different policy problem for states and localities than in the case of pensions. There's much more latitude to change the benefits, so much more of the risk is put on the workers than on the government. There are a lot of other issues, but those are probably the two.
All right. Anybody else? Yes, sir, right over here. Okay.
Yeah, I just had so that was one of my questions. So the status of unfunded liabilities in New York State's pension plan is $140 billion?
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I was talking about OPEB liabilities and roughly adding the state level and the New York City unfunded liabilities, and that doesn't even count counties and cities outside New York. But the pension system, I mean, you can get it from my slides. It would be a much smaller amount of unfunded liability than that. But I don't want to do it.
And my second question is, what is the outcome of this research and this modeling? Is there going to be any effort to take this to the state legislators and actually affect some positive change in the state system?
One piece of our work is designed to inform policymakers about the risks and to recommend ways to disclose those risks. It's not going to be our job to recommend that you don't take risk, but that the folks who are bearing it ought to know about it. So we will have focus groups with legislators and CFOs in parts of the country, but we're not going to advocate any particular legislation. I don't know if you...
Yes, sir.
I would say our answer is very similar.
Okay. Michelle?
Chris Anderson, Association of Towns. Don and Yimeng, you had mentioned in the next phase you're going to do a benefits analysis. Is this going to be a comparative benefits analysis?
No, what we're going to do is model specific plans. That's kind of the next phase of our work. So we're going to choose 5 plans around the country and model them in some detail. We're certainly going to pick a couple of highly stressed plans. So it might be a Chicago plan or a New Jersey plan. We'll pick at least one well-funded plan and at least one closed plan. Our model allows us to examine benefits so we can examine questions like, or we'll be able to examine questions like, what if benefits were changed prospectively, either for new hires, where we all know that the impacts are typically fiscally minimal, or what if benefits were to be changed prospectively for even existing workers. We'll be able to model those kinds of things. Legally, they're not, in fact, practical in some places.
Yes,
Hi,
over
your
here.
research found that,
Could you give your name?
sorry, my name is Chris Grant. I'm with New York State Department of State.
Okay.
Okay, so your research found that volatility is negatively correlated with alternative investments. So why not try to hedge your way out of, disaster scenarios through deeply out of the money, puts or calls?
Well, so I would say that that's a pretty rudimentary category, and I would be very cautious in assuming that what is being thrown in the category of alternatives by these state or by these large groups that are collecting the data is dominated by derivatives, and my assumption is that most of it is real estate investments and such that would be more stable and would therefore relate to what the direction of that association was.
Okay.
I
Just
think-
one more. Go ahead.
I think
Chen.
theoretically speaking, that's possible to hedge towards those risks. And I think that there's some research to show that it's able to do that. But practically, I would be very cautious to make that recommendation.
All right, we have time for one more, I'm afraid. We have 2 hands up, so make them real quick. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name's Ed Farrell. I represent retired public employees. I have an observation. First of all, regarding pensions, everybody knows pensions are constitutionally protected. Health benefits are not. In retirement, even though there's a large obligation, governments could walk away from that, and in some instances they do. So they're very different. I would think it would be more interesting, as opposed to comparing New York to South Dakota, or was it North? South. To look at what's happening with the new tiers. What's going to happen as you go out? What is Tier 6 going to do? And what perhaps would a Tier 7 look like? And how does that impact the system? I mean, there aren't any Tier 1s left.
Right.
So things are going to change.
Very good point. Okay.
Yeah, let me just respond and
Okay, quick response.
Let me just respond and say the tier issue is really important, and that's something that we're all getting into in our simulations to try and be able to add tiers. But the example that we provided was just to be able to show you that there's systems that are volatile and there's systems that are not volatile. So.
And one other quick point, actually, in some places, retiree health is actually protected. In Illinois, believe it or not, there is a constitutional protection.
Okay, yes, sir. Very last.
Hi, real quick question. My name is Chris Ketzley, town of Glenville. As I understand the presentation, I think about 91% of the retired contributions are paid by the taxpayer. Is that what I understood in the 91%? And if that's the case, is your work looking at requiring employees to take a bigger burden of that contribution so that there's no sunset to what the employee actually pays into the system? And then secondly, is your work looking at the real dollar in cost to the employee and the real dollar out benefit to the employee? Are you looking at any of that in your work and bringing that forward?
The 91% is the ratio of the actual contribution and the required contribution. So the actual contribution comes from the employees, the employer, and some systems also require some certain designated revenue. So that's at the 91% combination of everything. And yes, if we ask the employees to take a larger burden of this contribution, it's going to reduce the cost burden to the employer. And what is your second question?
What the real dollar
Cost
cost of the employee is versus the real dollar benefit out that they'll receive through their retirement.
I will have a look at that.
Well, we're definitely not examining that. I would say, though, that it's part of an overall compensation plan. So I guess I wouldn't particularly want to just compare what employees pay into what they get out. Folks who are examining those kinds of questions include Rich Johnson at Urban Institute and Alicia Manel at Center for Retirement Research.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, this is, like I said, these are early development of models. They're very sophisticated, but they really do capture a lot of the many variables that go into it. And I think eventually maybe they can be made to a point where legislative committees and state officials can actually use them to think through some of these policy issues. So thank you very much. Excellent presentations.